I think it was 2018. I was just lounging around with my buddies watching E3. I was actually waiting eagerly to see The Last of Us Part 2 and Spider-Man showcased. But I was caught off guard when after the Sony Interactive Entertainment faded from the screen, it was neither of those games. Instead, I began to hear a Japanese flute play as a samurai emerged from a forest. And as a huge fan of anime and Japanese culture, because let's face it, I'm a massive nerd and I'm not afraid to admit that, it immediately caught my eye. But once this mystery samurai completed a standoff with some Mongols, I was sold on the game. In an E3 with so many other heavy hitters shown, Ghost of Tsushima and its beautiful world and aesthetic won the year for me. And 2 years later, after having finally gotten the chance to play it, the excitement remains. Ghost of Tsushima, while not perfect, is the samurai game I've personally always wanted.
I am samurai, but I will sacrifice everything for my home.
I often talk to my friends about how personally video game graphics have peaked for me, and that how I appreciate games nowadays that have a unique art style, like Persona 5 or Breath of the Wild, for instance. In a gaming generation saturated with gorgeous, realistic worlds like Red Dead Redemption 2, Spider-Man, and The Last of Us Part 2, I felt as if nothing could really wow me anymore, as if we had really peaked. But Sucker Punch really made me eat those words, and I am so thankful for that. Ghost of Tsushima has a world that feels very much alive. It's got vast grassy plains where each blade of grass appears animated, dense lush forests, murky swamps, and even snow-capped mountains. And each of these areas has its own sense of beauty. Combine that with the game's stunning lighting, particle, and weather effects, along with the wind physics, which I'll come back to, and you get an incredibly picturesque world. Quite literally, actually. This is one of the few games where I spent time in photo mode because the game is just wallpaper bait. It constantly looks like a movie, and that's by design. The game is intentionally designed to feel like an old Japanese samurai film inspired heavily by the works of Akira Kurosawa. So much so that you can even add a Kurosawa filter to the game for extra immersion. Sucker Punch also does a great job incentivizing you to explore too, by pumping the game full of discoverable locations like Pillars of Honor, Fox Dens, Shrines, Hot Springs, Haikus, and Bamboo Strikes. Each of these gives you something to help you on your journey, like increasing health or resolve or giving you charms with unique effects, while others give you new vanity gear like headwear and sword kits. Doing these things always paid off by giving you something at least mildly useful while also allowing you to see some breathtaking sights along the way. Especially haikus and shrines. Haikus seem to have been specifically designed to show off the world's finer details, and it does a great job of that, while the shrines were used for the opposite. They had me traversing a dilapidated mountain path to enjoy some truly stunning broad views of the world as a whole, and the game has probably the coolest innovation I have seen in recent years to help you find your objective. Instead of throwing up a marker on your screen when you have a location tagged, Ghost introduced this guiding wind feature, which, when swiping up on the touchpad, kicks up wind always blowing in the direction of your objective. It is such a unique way to lead you to your destination without cluttering your screen at the same time. It has its own canonical tie-in to the story, and it was a great way to show off the world's wind physics as it interacts with the gorgeous world around it. And that gorgeous world is accompanied by and enhanced by the game's phenomenal music score. While only being 22 tracks long, the soundtrack does a phenomenal job of captivating the feel of Japanese-style music. No, not that. I meant this. Its use of traditional Japanese instruments like the biwa and the shakuhachi add wonderfully to the atmosphere of the game. I earned an extra respect for the soundtrack when I learned the biwa was featured heavily in Shimura's theme, which is something samurai learned as a form of mental training, fitting heavily into Shimura's theme of being a samurai who upholds the code and traditions. The entire soundtrack is just filled with incredibly on-point music, especially during the game's heavier moments. The end of Act 2 and the credits come to mind specifically. Music can make or break emotional scenes in any media, and Sucker Punch spared no expense. The end of Act 2 and Act 3 were heightened so much by The Way of the Ghost featuring Claire Uchima. The soundtrack was able to make me feel when it wanted me to. And honestly, for me personally, that is a big deal. If a game can use a soundtrack to make me feel emotions, strong emotions either one way or the other, that game has done a phenomenal job. But unfortunately, that beautiful world and soundtrack is a bit of a double-edged sword too in the game. You can tell that the realistic world and the atmosphere is where Sucker Punch poured most of their time and energy when developing this game, and it came at a cost. There were a lot of imperfections in Ghost of Tsushima and areas for improvement. One such place was its character models and motion capture. While the character models met the bar of expectation for a game in 2020, when compared to how the world looked they resided in, I couldn't help but think the model stood out for looking a bit stiff. It has that issue that a lot of open world RPGs have, like Horizon Zero Dawn and Assassin's Creed, where during cutscenes all the characters are very stiff and robotic, and despite speaking, their mouths don't really move all that much. Sucker Punch tried to cover this up under the guise of cinematics by using the cinema bars, going to wide shots, or making quick cuts to avoid seeing those little imperfections, but you could always tell. These imperfections extended to the gameplay as well, as I noticed a lot of bugs while playing. Most were incredibly minor, like the horse bugging out or item textures not loading in the menu, but others were more impactful, like when occasionally approaching people in or out of combat, they would react as if they had been stabbed, along with the appropriate sound effect. The other big bug I encountered was getting soft-locked into side quests. One time specifically, I was trying to investigate an area, and when I would hit the button to crouch down and interact, he would just freeze in place. No dialogue, no thought process, he would just stop, which left me pretty damn confused the first time it happened.
Huh?
The only way to fix it was restarting the game, which makes these bugs pretty damn significant. But thankfully, the majority of these bugs were relegated to free roam and not to the combat, which, by the way, is a lot of fun. Combat has a lot of elements we see in modern action RPGs, like parry-based combat, stealth, a skill tree, and free climbing. But fortunately, unlike those other games, Sucker Punch did a good job of making combat enjoyable instead of tedious. Combat never got boring to me personally, despite its repetitive nature, and I think a big part of that had to do with all the ways you could attack a situation. If you decide to play more like a samurai, then you start things off with a standoff, which is the most satisfying combat mechanic in the game. I mean, just look at this. You gotta admit, that was pretty cool. And following the standoff, there is plenty going on as well, which is good and bad. Most enemies come in 4 standard types: sword, shield, spear, and brute. There are other cons like guys who throw bombs or shoot bows and arrows. But unlike most games where that doesn't really change your approach to just hit them until they're dead, each different enemy's type has a corresponding sword stance: stone, wind, water, and moon. It causes you to often think on the fly and be aware of who is attacking. And it lends itself to those who like taking the initiative in combat, and to those, like myself, who would rather react than act. Triangle for heavy attacks allow you to break down the enemy's defenses and then quickly kill them with square for quick attacks, or you can wait for the enemy to attack you and either dodge or parry, which, depending on the timing, can leave them open for a few attacks or completely annihilate their defenses while dealing massive damage. There was also a 5th stance you can unlock by playing the story, called the Ghost Stance. By avoiding all enemy attacks and after dealing enough damage, or by slaughtering a Mongol leader, a meter will fill. Once it does, you can activate Ghost Stance, which tinges the screen blood red and terrifies enemies, allowing, for a short time, you to instantly kill any enemy. I really like the idea of this stance because it's a great way to reward the player for dealing a lot of damage without being hit, or by stealthily killing a Mongol leader without being seen. I equate this stance to an ultimate move, and it is within this stance that you feel the most like the feared ghost. Hence, probably why it's called the Ghost Stance. The issue that arose from these stances, though, is that the game will try to force you to switch if you spend too long attacking with the wrong stance. Sometimes there just isn't enough time to switch the stances on the fly, and this was compounded by the lack of an ability to lock on. Despite supposedly being able to target enemies by pointing the left stick, oftentimes it felt like Jin would attack whomever he wanted. A lock-on feature would solve this issue and make combat flow much easier, and help to curb the issue with the stances. The lack of a lock-on is my biggest gripe with the combat, as it should be a common sense addition to any RPG at this point. Other than swordplay though, there are plenty of other combat mechanics somebody could use. So much so that it's actually a bit overwhelming. The bow, poison darts, smoke bombs, sticky bombs, kunai, and wind chimes are all things you can use. They all worked fine, but I just never really felt inclined to use them when the sword combat itself was so much better. They were just kind of there. And the big problem with these other mechanics is all in accessing them. To access all of these, you need to either hold down R2 or L2 and hit a face button and or a directional button all at the same time. I kept getting confused trying to access my weapons this way, and in the heat of combat I would often hit the wrong buttons in the wrong order. I wish instead of several tacked on mechanics, they spent more time putting the final touches on the swordplay itself, as it's almost perfect. When the sword makes contact and during perfect parries, the blade felt heavy. It felt as if it was doing real damage. And for those exact reasons is why I hardly used anything outside the sword, because despite no lock-on, the swordplay was super satisfying. On the flip side, the stealth in the game was just okay. It wasn't bad, it wasn't great, it was pretty much the par for stealth in video games nowadays. You could hide in grass, climb on roofs, assassinations, and its own breed of listen mode. Pretty standard stuff. If you enjoy playing stealth, it will suit you just fine. But the stakes aren't very high for getting caught. You just gotta samurai the shit out of them if you do. Chain assassinations were pretty awesome though, as were the assassinations through the shoji. The weather also changed depending on your playstyle too, which was an awesome detail for Ghost mode. Because if you liked playing Ghost, thunderstorms would begin to appear the more stealthily you played. It was a really cool extra detail, one of those details that I really appreciate the game for. Another detail that I appreciate the game for was how it handles its leveling system. Like most modern action RPGs, accomplishing tasks gives you points to spend on a skill tree, but there are no levels for you or your enemy, so to speak. Your level is the title you bear. Since there are no traditional levels, every enemy is beatable, as the deciding factor will always be your skill as a player. But that doesn't mean the stronger enemies won't kick your ass if you fight them unprepared. The game doesn't force you to grind side missions and skill points, but it will make completing the story easier. But grinding side missions and mythic quests, at the very least, were simple and easy, and at the best, told some very engaging stories. The side missions in the game were nothing innovative. Most of them were follow this guy or kill these guys. But what I really appreciated was how brief they were. Most of the side missions, with the exception of the side quests involving actual characters from the story, could be finished within about 10 minutes. So they never dragged and felt like a burden to me. But that doesn't mean there weren't longer side missions as well. Throughout the story, you meet many characters, specifically Yuna, Ishikawa, Masako, and Norio. You recruit these characters to help you take back the island, but they have their own stories to tell. What I really loved about how these stories' characters were handled is the fact that they were side missions. You could choose to do them if you wanted, but the game doesn't force you to. I personally chose to complete their individual stories before completing the main one, as to me it felt like it gave the characters a reason to fight, as they had forged a relationship with Jin. Each one of these individual storylines is interesting enough to play, especially Masako's. Masako was a straight up badass. She also had the best theme in the entire game. Like, this shit slaps. But let's say you only want to play side quests with worthwhile rewards. Well, those exist too. They're called mythic quests. These quests always started off with a beautifully animated calligraphy-style story about the origins of this skill or equipment, and led you on a hunt that took you to some beautiful locations or ended in some duels with amazing atmosphere. These were the best side quests the game had to offer. And this leads me to the actual story of the game. So of course, before I go any deeper, spoiler warning, skip to the time on the screen if you don't want to get spoiled. You know the drill at this point.
Playing Japanese!
Now that that's out of the way, the story for this game rocks. Jin's story is one following his descent from honor-bound samurai to becoming the ghost, who will use any means to defeat his enemies and defend his home. And it comes at the cost of being branded a traitor by his own people for breaking the samurai code. The life of a samurai is clear-cut. They followed the ethic code of the Bushido, which stressed concepts such as loyalty to one's master, self-discipline, and respectful ethical behavior. And this belief is extended to and expected of enemies. But the Mongols, who have no code when fighting wars, caused Jin to break his own. I feel as if I should have more to say about Khatun Khan, the leader of the Mongols, as on the surface he is the main antagonist of the game. But that's honestly just it. It's on the surface only. He wipes out the samurai, tries to sway Shimura and the Ronin, and is terrorizing the island in an attempt to conquer it. But that's it. The Khan is nothing more than a vehicle driving the plot, a catalyst for Jin's development and to create discord for the real conflict of the story. While Jin himself only struggled at the beginning with abandoning his honor, it's how it affected his relationships that hit the hardest. Most notably, his uncle and island Jito, Shimura. The father-son-esque relationship Jin and Shimura had was the driving force in the game, and as the game went on, it became clear the growing rift between them was the central conflict of this game. It wasn't about driving off the Mongols, it was about if the means it took were worth it. Jin represented adaptability and survival, while Shimura represented tradition and honor. The game does an awesome job showcasing how much of an impact Shimura had on Jin growing up, showing that, while stuck in his ways, Shimura cares deeply for him. The game was at its peak whenever it flashed back to Jin's childhood and gave us a more in-depth look on their relationship as not just mentor and pupil, but also father and son. These moments stood to really highlight the pain both characters suffered as Jin strayed from the samurai path. Jin knew Shimura's ways would never take back the island, and Shimura knew Jin's underhanded methods would have him branded a traitor. This caused them to become reluctant allies and, eventually, reluctant enemies. Because, above all else, beyond even his love for his nephew, Shimura is a man bound to his honor. This led to very bittersweet endings, and I'm a sucker for bittersweet endings. And yes, that's endings plural. Shimura being commanded by the shogun to take Jin's head to both restore order on the island and punish Jin for breaking the samurai code, while predictable, still hit that note just right. The final duel between the two at the end was extremely painful, but beautiful at the same time. Shimura was only upholding his orders and, like Jin, clearly didn't want to fight. The setting for this fight, under the falling red leaves, the same type of tree that they first trained under, is a wonderful coming full circle moment, and I can't say there was a wrong choice to make at the end. They both felt as if they could fit. Choosing to spare Shimura isn't wrong because Jin already sacrificed his honor and lost all of his family. He shouldn't have to see another loved one die. But killing him isn't wrong either. It would uphold Shimura's honor as it was his final request to be killed and allow him to view Jin as a samurai one last time. Regardless of the choice made at the end, when the credits rolled, I felt a pit in my stomach. Jin fought and saved his home, but in the process he lost everything and everyone he loved. It was a truly wonderful, bittersweet ending. I really enjoyed it. Speaking of endings, I think it's about time I wrapped this up. If I were to try and tie a nice little bow on this review, I would say Ghost of Tsushima is so close to perfect. The world is beautiful and incredibly detailed with lots of things to find and do, that it makes up for the not as good character models. The gameplay has plenty of mechanics and the swordplay is satisfying, but the layout can often be confusing and the lack of lock-on can make targeting a hassle. But with an incredibly bittersweet story that doesn't require much grinding, and a lot of other side content that is optional and adds more depth, it's easy to look past the smaller imperfections. I think Ghost of Tsushima honestly deserves an 8 out of 10.